All right, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Juan Melendez. I'll be your moderator today. I myself am a HillVets lead protege with a background as a Navy veteran / Navy civilian and currently a DoD fellow over at the House. With me today, I have some great panelists. We'll start off with Steve Beynon. Just a little bit about Steve. Steve Beynon covers ground combat for military.com and is based in Washington, D.C. He's also an Afghanistan war veteran, serving over a decade as a cavalry scout and currently serves as a non-commissioned officer in the National Guard. He previously covered Capitol Hill and the Department of Veterans Affairs for Stars and Stripes. His work has also appeared in Politico, the Washington Examiner, National Guard Magazine, and Military Times. And moving on to Dan Lamothe from the Post. Dan Lamothe is a national security writer with the Washington Post, focusing on the Pentagon and U.S. military. He joined the newspaper in 2014 and has traveled extensively since then, interviewing service members on battlefields, in aircrafts, and on ships at sea. Prior to joining the Post, Dan covered the military for Foreign Policy magazine and for nearly 6 years with Marine Corps Times, where he completed 3 weeks-long Embeds with infantry units in combat in southern Afghanistan. The experiences included taking cover in several firefights, witnessing improvised explosive device explosions, and many, many patrols. And finally, we have Zack Baddorf.
Close enough.
So Zack Baddorf is a national security and foreign policy professional with more than 15 years experience on the front lines of the world's conflicts, including Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Central African Republic, Crimea, Kashmir, and the West Bank. And finally, Baddorf teaches at NYU's Global Affairs program on disinformation and runs a small nonprofit, Military Veterans in Journalism. Thank you for joining us today. So today, from the Communications and Media Fire Panel, I'd like to share our panel today, which will be 20 Years of War, the Evolution and Impact of MilVet Media. We'd like to start off with the Global War on Terror. The longest war in our nation's history has now lasted for a total of 20 years. During this time, the journalistic landscape has changed drastically. With the rise of social media, the divestment of large newspaper publications, and the spread of targeted disinformation. This panel seeks to discuss those changes and how they've affected the military and veteran media space. We hope to look at the positive and negative effects of these changes, why they're so important, and what the landscape will look like moving forward. And with that, we'll just roll right over into our questions. All right, gentlemen, over the last 20 years, the rise of social media has transformed the journalistic landscape and the types of stories we're seeing today. I'd like to discuss how social media has redefined journalism, obviously large publications, how they've changed, the rise of bloggers and military-focused media, and any positive and negative impacts you've seen in your experience.
I'd say at least for me that social media has been such a great tool to talk to soldiers and other troops that are on the ground within the ranks, instead of just relying on public affairs people in military units and just the word of generals. It's so easy for me to put a call to action out on social media, on Twitter. Hey, I need to talk about this. I'll get a minimum 15 soldiers or people from other branches reaching out to me about a subject, and it's so easy to cross-check with what someone says in a press conference or what a public affairs officer tells me, and then, hey, I'm talking to these soldiers, and here's what they're telling me. And it's easy for them to reach out to me or other reporters, presumably, about things that are happening on the ground, and that kind of guides the media of where the story is.
Thank you. Zack?
Can I turn it to you? Sure. I would say it's definitely a net positive with reservations. On the positive side, I think it's flattened communication. I think it has given more people a voice, both veterans and active duty. On the negative side, it can be a pretty bitter, nasty place. There's pile-ons on things that at times I think seem unnecessary. I think sometimes there's bad faith conversations that are challenging, and we have to work through that too.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I come at it from a sort of different vantage point. I'm not doing reporting anymore these days. I'm running this little nonprofit, and my day job is with the Air Force in public affairs, not speaking on behalf of the Air Force. And so I see this, obviously, the net positives that you guys talked about. That's great. I also see the way that the media environment has transformed to be more polarizing and more makes more silos. And I also see a lot of news outlets not really investing in military reporting. So you have outlets like military.com and Military Times, but then you have others like New York Times that have shut down at war, for example, and are not investing in getting more veterans onto their staff. So I think that the economic model of these news outlets has changed, and there is a broader effort across the media landscape to diversify their newsrooms, but it often doesn't include veterans.
Thank you. Something I'd like to touch upon, and I think Dan might have spoken on it, just a little bit about, obviously with the rise of social media, it's given access to more people to tell their stories, including veterans and service members. Also want to talk about the darker side of that, just talking about disinformation, what that leads to in that space, and what your experience has been with that and how that's affected your own journalistic careers.
I would say as a starting point, and I think people have gotten smarter with this over time, but just there's a need to take everything with a grain of salt, particularly from accounts you don't know, particularly from accounts where you're not sure if they are who they say they are. And I think there's at times a big risk of what I like to call the people on Twitter be saying sort of story, because the stories, there's so much nuance that gets lost when you're writing a story off of what gets said on a given day on a social media app. So it's good as a starting point, but I think that because it speeds things up so much, context, nuance, polarization, like there's threats for all those.
And because newsrooms have largely divested in military reporting, which if you think about the DoD and the Department of Veterans Affairs, they make up the bulk of where our tax dollars come from. And a lot of these newsrooms have gotten rid of that, but they'll still have like fashion reporters and video game reporters, bridal reporters that major, not that there's anything wrong with those. Those people do great stuff. But what our government actually does the most of isn't getting covered. So there's a lot of individual reporters that are great at these outlets, but they probably don't have all the resources necessary. They don't have large teams. They're small niche outlets like mine, Military Times, Task and Purpose. So with disinformation and how it relates to the troops and the military, there's just not a lot of information out there. Like the niche outlets, they just realistically can't cover everything. So if there's bad information out there, there's just not a lot of ways for troops to check that information.
And military veterans, as we know, are also targeted specifically for disinformation. There was a report that Chris Goldsmith put together, excellent report on this issue. And I think it's important that we recognize that veterans represent a cross-section of Americans. So they are equally as susceptible to disinformation as any other American. But it comes back to, I think, media literacy, and whether we're targeting the larger population to become better at consuming information, or veterans. We need to have more focus on that, because everybody in this room probably consumes a wide range of news outlets every single day to get a varied perspective, but not all Americans will do that, and they'll go down the rabbit hole that social media, that these algorithms direct them down.
Another thing I think it's important to acknowledge here, I can name veterans at the Post, at the Times, at the Journal, at the Associated Press. I mean, a lot of the big heavy hitter news outlets all do invest in veterans. It's not all veterans; it simply can't be. But where I see a huge gap is if you play this back at the beginning of these wars, places like newspapers in Texas, California, Georgia, where there's always military bases, where there were always units deploying from people's backyards. A lot of those newspapers are shrinking or shriveling. And for me, that's a bigger concern. It's one thing to have big national outlets that can cover the military and do our best. But without the kind of coverage where it's sort of a little bit more neighborly, it's a little bit more about what the guy down the street is doing. I think there's a huge gap there. And the nonprofits have popped up and they have made some positive changes, but it's simply not getting at the whole problem in terms of what's lost.
And you brought up Chris Goldsmith and his work. He does a lot of great work on extremism and stuff like that. I recommend everyone check out. And it's more about like how these algorithms target people. I'm in the military. I like to, I buy guns. I look up that kind of stuff. And it's really easy to see, like I've had the algorithm on Facebook show me things that would probably be considered extremist content. I look up one thing that's pretty nonchalant, or I buy something, or I shop on a website, and it goes from, hey, you like pistol grips, and then it goes to, hey, do you want to prep for the government taking over? These algorithms, they happen so fast, and I'm a guy that I read the New York Times every morning. So someone that doesn't have maybe it is a media literacy issue, and it's really fast how simple, innocent ways of using the internet can quickly pull someone down a rabbit hole.
Thank you. I think you brought up some good topics there. I think one of the ones I kind of want to touch on is over the last 20 years, just essentially how journalists have related to military culture and access that the military is also granted. I'm just curious, over the last 20 years, what your experience is. I know we've spoken a little bit about Embeds. We've also spoken to just public affairs officers, and over the last 20 years, I'm just curious what you've seen in your experience.
So my first embed was 6 weeks with an infantry unit in 2010, back when long embeds were still happening. I think about 3 of those 6 weeks were with the infantry battalion. It was a Camp Lejeune battalion. It was in Marja, Afghanistan. And I had been covering the Marine Corps maybe a year and a half at that point. And just the immersive experience in terms of going from covering it and popping up at places like Quantico to, sleeping on the ground next to people, being in firefights with people. And then I think importantly, having long conversations about family and life around a smoke pit at midnight. I think that's where you pick up the nuance and the culture and a healthy appreciation for kind of in total what the job is and what we ask of our American service members. The embeds have shrunk both in length and in frequency. My last one was just before COVID. Really, I was embedded with General Miller's staff right before the deal with the Taliban got signed. And that was about a week, maybe 10 days. But that had been the exception. Virtually every other embed I have done over the last 5 years has been somewhere in the ballpark of about 2 to 3 days. So you're asking a newspaper to invest in flights from DC, flights from Virginia, Carolina, wherever else they're coming from, to then spend 48 hours or less, usually with a pre-approved list of people that are able to talk to you on the record. It's simply not like the old days of, talking at length. And I mean, you'd have the conversation, all right, do you want to be on the record or not? And back then, usually my experience was they did. They wanted to tell their story.
Could I ask, do they give you a justification for why they're so short?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's multifaceted. I think some of them are fair reasons. We don't have 100,000 people in Afghanistan. We don't have 120,000 in Iraq. So there realistically are not as many opportunities. But I think sometimes that's a crutch and an excuse to not be creative and not look for ways to tell the stories. As a result, we frequently hear criticism of the media that we're listening too much to the generals. But the next piece of that is we're often not given the access to talk to others.
Yeah, I think there's a mix of public affairs people that are really media savvy, that are generous with roundtables and stuff like that, or even providing soldiers in very specific circumstances. But there are others that definitely have a media trust issue that seems to be within that culture for one reason or another. So I think maybe just moving forward is trying to build those relationships.
Yeah, again, I come from a different sort of vantage point. I was in the Navy doing public affairs, active duty, and now I've done freelance journalism for the Times and other folks over the years. So I've been on the side where I've been demanding information from public affairs, and oftentimes that relationship has been adversarial because I'm finding human rights issues and things like that with their partner forces. And on the other hand, I've also been on the public affairs side, and I always try to advocate for more and more access, because I think, first of all, it's the obligation of public affairs to provide that access and for the public to know this full story. But I guess I would say that it's yeah, I understand both perspectives, and but in addition to that, I think sometimes there can be that adversarial relationship and distrust that I've seen certainly within public affairs, but also ground level troops who might not have ever interacted with media before.
Thank you. So just moving forward, and I think some of you touched on it. What do you think are some improvements that can be made on both sides to kind of bridge that gap and get back to where we might have been a little bit not so long ago?
I think public affairs in the military can take a page out of how normal comms operates in companies or on Capitol Hill. On Capitol Hill, I have to kick comms people away a lot, or like always pitching me on what their boss is doing. That just doesn't happen in the military, really. It's not like, hey, look at what my unit's doing. Look at this soldier. It's like, I don't care your soldier got a 600 on this ACFT, but that just doesn't happen though. So it's the public affairs people being more involved in military communities online that could help, being more media savvy and building those individual relationships with reporters versus looking at the media as an apparatus, which people talk a lot about, like the media and problems, versus like, I know this reporter at the Washington Post, I know this reporter at Stars and Stripes, and I think they need to dial it down and build those relationships. At the same time, reporters need to go out there and talk to the rank and file troops more. It's hard to find, it's hard to do that, but the more they do that, and public affairs people see that I'm not trying to ruin the life of some E5 or something, right? Like, or get some private in trouble. And the more that they see that we're being responsible with our reporting and how we're talking to people and how we're listening to information, I think that will build the trust as well.
One thing, I think I'm fortunate to have been on the beat as long as I have, because I do have times where people pitch me, good profile ideas where, they're willing to offer up not only themselves at some length, but hey, here are 6, 8, 10 people that you might want to talk to, and they don't throw up all the roadblocks that you sometimes get without the trust and longevity. But it's rare, and if it's rare with a dozen years on the military beat, then it's certainly more rare with less. I think on the media side, overall we need to continue investing in ways to just get at like ground level access. And certainly that's not going to be in large numbers overseas anymore. So, I think it takes things like spending, going to a training rotation at Quantico or NTC or something like that, where, they're doing, training operations that might resemble what you would see in a real life situation. But there's not always the immediate news value. So it's being creative about like, okay, what is this representative of, and why do I need to tell my readers about this?
Sure.
Again, I'll come at it from two vantage points. I remember, I guess it was 2012. Maybe you guys remember, there was AC-130 that shot up some Pakistani troops on the border. And, there was a big investigation. They shut down the border area. Supplies stopped. It was a big international furor. And the U.S. government moved at the speed of government, which is to say very, very slow. And they didn't respond, basically. And the State Department was involved in DOD, and this is all public now. And it took like months for the U.S. government, the CENTCOM, I think, to put out a report that basically explained that the same Pakistani troops had been firing on Afghan children the prior day, that had been supplying weapons to the Taliban across the border, blah, 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 all these different things that explained why this particular incident happened and why they were in fact fired upon. So, these things take time to elaborate, but I think the US government, broadly speaking, can do a better job at communicating in the media environment which we're in now, which is not minute by minute, day by day, it's second by second practically. And that's for the benefit of the US government to get its message out and to counter propaganda in Pakistan in this particular case. And it's also to the benefit to the news media. The other thing I want to add from the press perspective, coming from my role in military veterans and journalism, is looking at the percentage of military veterans who are represented in newsrooms. They are vastly underrepresented. 7.5%-ish of Americans served in the armed forces. If you look at newsrooms across the country, according to census data, it's roughly 2%. So there's a long way for newsrooms to go to reflect the diversity of the country, and we're fighting to do that. I think the more that you have veterans in there, there's a lot of benefits. We all know that why you should hire veterans, but they also bring with them a Rolodex of folks and a lot of connections. I certainly leaned on my connections from my military time when I was reporting and got done a lot of stuff that would not have been possible had I not had both those relationships over the years.
Great, thank you. Over the last 20 years, we've seen obviously a variety of different presidential administrations. I'm curious from your guys' experience within those different administrations, how you felt press freedom sentiment might have changed within each one, and how that affected your reporting in military and veteran spaces.
I mean, certainly there's been a change over time. I think some of it is the administrations. I think some of it is just when a war drags on, or when wars drag on as long as they have, there's usually less and less good news to talk about, which disincentivizes, I don't care who's in charge, to talk about them. So I have seen a shrinking from being willing to talk just candidly. When there's no good news, usually you just don't talk at all. It's often the viewpoint we get. So that's part of it. The polarization that came with the Trump administration, I think, is a significant issue. And you can agree or disagree with the policy decisions they made. The manner, the environment, the nastiness that often went with it challenged not only reporters, but also general officers and others to just talk candidly. So they too, that was another reason to kind of pull back. We went through an era when there was very rarely on the record, on camera press conferences at the Pentagon. Lasted almost, I would say, 3 of the 4 years of the Trump administration. We just barely ever saw them on camera. You could engage with them in more privately. You can engage with them in, off-camera settings. They would come down and see the press corps on occasion, but it wasn't normal. And I think there was a cumulative effect of if I don't see my 4-star on camera on occasion, then as a 1-star, as a colonel, why would I talk to you? The risk management, there's just no incentive to do so.
Yeah, and like you said, there's just the longer a war drags out, it's like what would be the incentives to talk about it, especially with a war like Afghanistan. We're not taking hills and towns and territories. At least with my experience in Afghanistan, I just sat around an outpost and got shot at for a year. It's like, what are you gonna tell the press about that? It's like, yeah, they're still there. Yeah, they got shot at Thursday. Nothing follows. Like there's just not a sexy story other than, yeah, it's still happening. Like, so if to be motivated to talk to the press, being a war, and the people have an entitlement to know about it, even if maybe the public doesn't demand a lot of information about it.
Prior to taking this Air Force gig, I most recently lived in the Central African Republic, and a lot of my reporting has been outside the U.S., and I would get statements from the U.S. government, but really interacted with them very regularly, so I haven't really noticed any changes one way or the other.
If I could add one more point there, I think one frustration for a lot of us in my job is just a general disappointment with a lot of our fellow Americans who just don't seem to follow the news on these things well. The metrics would show that, I can write a deeply sourced story about, Afghanistan or what happened with the Navy with Iran, and depending on, unless there's a political tie to the story, often it just passes readers by. It's offered up. It's not that the media didn't cover it. That's a criticism we hear a lot. Why isn't the media? The reality is the media usually does, and you probably just didn't see it.
Yeah, that's why you see news outlets write things that you would associate with maybe like BuzzFeed doing or something like that. There's just, the public doesn't have time to read about war. There's maybe not an appetite unless we're actively invading, unless there's like a new war, unless it's got that new war smell, right? Like, I don't know what there should be an appetite for it. That's the problem with the system, but if you're a single mother in Wisconsin and you're working 2 jobs and picking your kids up at daycare, is like, when are you going to read about the Iraq war, and why do you care that we got in a firefight in Nigeria? Like, why do you care, right? And so that's sort of the weird. That's the dichotomy here. That's a lot of the issues on both our ends.
No, you bring up a good point. So we're talking the last 20 years, the longest war in history. Has that changed the way we view war as a people, how we report on it? I mean, you just brought up some good points. I mean, after a while, I'm sure there are people out there that don't even know that we're leaving a conflict. So,
yeah, I mean, I wasn't around during World War II, right? So there's, but if you go back and read, like I went back and glanced at like old front pages of Stars and Stripes and stuff like that. You'll see like, hey, we're in this town. The Yankees are on the march through Germany. Like there's stories involved, and now it's just become part of it. Like I've worked with 18-year-old soldiers. They weren't even alive during 9/11. War is just part of the equation. It's like the trees outside. No one thinks about it anymore. It's just part of the American lifestyle. And you have something as broad as the war on terror. It's like police fighting gangs. There's always going to be a gang somewhere. So we're always going to be in some place like Africa or the Middle East or the Philippines fighting terror. And I think people, there's no capital city to take.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen data, but I would imagine that the perception of the U.S. military has probably shifted a fair amount in the post 9/11 like days to now. War fatigue, certainly less people reading about war, less coverage overall. I think, interestingly, in the past, I guess, 6 months or so, I didn't be interested to see how the perception of the military has shifted as a result of veteran and active duty involvement in the siege on the Capitol. I think, and also the Defense Department's focus on extremism within the ranks. I think the way that some of these stories have been framed, including by veterans, by the way, can create a perception that there is more extremism within there. And I think I'm curious to see what the long-term and even medium-term effects are on our focus on this issue, which is a real issue, by the way. I'm not neglecting it, but I think sometimes the focus on these things can make it seem more proportional than it is.
One of the cases I make, and it mostly falls on deaf ears so far, but I'll keep making it, is I think, for years and years, decades really, the military was one of the most trusted institutions in the United States of America, for a lot of good reasons. And I think we're seeing that get chipped away in a lot of ways by things that are absolutely fair, such as how we talk about a long-running multi-billion or trillion-dollar war, and the way we're always turning a corner until we're not. But then also like all the bad faith polarization that has affected so many other parts of our country. Now, we can, you watch a hearing this morning, you've got the Secretary of Defense and you've got the chairman up there, and they're having to talk about whether they're too woke. Like there's, I don't know where we go with that. Like it's going to be a problem long term for the military. They need to deal with these issues. They need to deal with them in context. But every time we have these conversations, you're chipping away at potential groups of people likely to enlist.
But also, I think it's a fair thing, and maybe we do need to stop hero worshiping. I feel like sometimes we put these veterans on a pedestal. Speaking as a veteran, and I think that like there are racists in America, there are racists in the military. It's just the way life is, and like, is there a disproportionate amount of racists in the military? I don't know. I don't think we have solid data on that right now. But I think that like we need to acknowledge that our veterans are humans as well.
Okay, you actually bring up a good point. The next thing I'd like to talk about are veterans. We talked about the rise of social media and how veterans are now utilizing that space to get their own stories out, which obviously 20 years ago was a totally different landscape. Just if you could speak to, as veterans put out their stories and allow more people access to, issues like PTSD, sexual assault, having open stories and open conversations about these things. Obviously, there are benefits and dangers. So what advice would you have to any veterans or even service members that would like to use social media in that aspect, but are maybe, need a little advice.
Yeah, I would say first, I would be glad. Obviously, I'm a reporter. I want everyone to talk about everything. It's great. But no, actually be careful. I mean, I don't want any soldier's career to be tanked about talking about something in public. But a really good example of this was when the National Guard put the troops in the parking lot or the parking garage at the Capitol, right? They had beds and cots in a nice warm building, and they said, go in the parking garage. There's one toilet for 5,000 soldiers, and there's like car fumes and exhaust. A bunch of them were contacting me and contacting other reporters, contacting their congressman or senator or whatever, like, and a lot of that through Twitter and Facebook. And that issue got fixed in like 3 hours, like max. And that's a really good example of some colonel or something put those troops down there for some reason. I still don't know why. I don't know if the Capitol janitors had to vacuum and someone just played a game of telephone and that means, oh, they got to vacuum, so all the troops got to go outside. But the actual enlisted and lower ranking officers on the ground used their voices and they said, hey, this is crazy. Like it's just unsanitary at a certain level. And no one got in trouble. And that's an effective use of social media and solving a problem.
Just a quick PSA on behalf of public affairs here. Not speaking for the Air Force. We have, as service members, have First Amendment rights, but they're limited, and there are sometimes consequences for the things you say. So, I guess I would say consider those consequences.
I cover a lot of trauma, just in general, ranging from things in the military to I was temporarily detailed last year and ended up covering a hurricane in Louisiana. So you just kind of see a scope. And whenever I'm handling stories like that, I'm trying to make sure sources are thinking through the second and third order effects of talking, because I feel like there's a responsibility to that. Usually they want to talk if they've already gotten as far as reaching out to me, then they're probably pretty convinced they want to do so. But when you remove a couple layers and just put a Twitter account in front of them, the problem is you can never take it back. Screen grabs and whatever else, it's gone. So like I often find myself talking to people like, are you sure you want to do this? And in this format, like Steve, I'm trying to encourage people to speak, but I'm also trying to encourage them to think about what this looks like a year later. Because if it goes sideways, I will feel some personal responsibility, even if it wasn't my professional responsibility to deal with the fallout.
And it's about having some responsibility. I had a story that about a year ago I didn't run. There was a female soldier that came to me with a very horrible rape story, right? And she wanted to go on the record by name and like name bases and commanders and everything. I talked to her for probably 5 hours, and for a complicated list of reasons, mainly because there was a reason to think she would be attacked by the man she wanted the name. We didn't run the story. And then I talked to her like a month later and she's like, thank God we didn't run that story. And instead put her in contact with appropriate sources for physical and mental health treatment. So it's also on reporters to use some common sense and not get greedy about a story that's good, because you do have to protect sources and you have to make the troops understand consequences of, hey, do you want to be anonymous? Do you want to go by name? If you go by name here, first, you're definitely going to hear from a public affairs officer. And if you don't care about that, that's fine. But I'm just going to tell you that's going to happen. And it's just making them aware of their options and consequences of what they decide to do.
Great, thank you. So we've talked about the last 20 years. Let's move looking forward the next 20. We've touched a variety of subjects and issues. What do you think can be done in the MilVet space to kind of touch upon some of these? For instance, we talk about disinformation, we talk about access, we talk about social media, we talk about resources, education. Just curious what your opinions are.
I guess I see it as sort of at least twofold. One is we're going to continue to be in places and we're going to continue to deploy, and there's probably some conflict we're not even aware of popping up that very well could be a part of our reality within a year or 3 or 5. So there's that. There's the looking forward piece. The other thing is I think we've got an entire generation that grew up at war, whether or not you deployed, whether or not you joined the military, or whether or not it's simply the guy down the street. We've all kind of grown up with this mindset. And I think about it sometimes. I keep talking to Afghan vets at this point, and Vietnam often comes up. It seems like a lot of them are reading about Vietnam now. It seems, and there's no perfect comparison here. I mean, there are a lot of differences, but in terms of the way that war lasted a long time, the way those veterans were treated, and I mean, it's not a one-to-one comparison, but I know they're thinking about those things, and I know some of you probably are. So how we frame those stories, how we tell those stories, you know, the issues that'll pop up long term, not just in terms of like, you know, the history piece to this, but in terms of the fallout, the burn pit stuff, all of those things. You know, like there will be long lasting consequences and a lot of money that needs to be spent to get this right and take care of people long term. And if they don't talk enough, it's easy to kind of push it in the corner and forget.
I'm thinking a lot lately about the next war. There will be another war at some point with somebody, and the media needs to be a lot more aggressive with why are we fighting this war and the second and third effects of what that is. Like you brought up burn pits, right? That is a huge healthcare bill that Congress is thinking about passing. Right, that's the largest healthcare bill since Obamacare. So it's not just going to war. And how much money does it cost to send tanks and soldiers to invade a country? It's not that. You got to take care. We're going to be paying for the Afghanistan war for the next 100 years till the last veteran dies. This is an expensive thing for the country, and it's an emotionally taxing thing for the country. And we got to be more smart about if something happens, do we need to go to war? What are those reasons are?
We need more veterans in journalism. So sign up today. Military veterans in journalism. We're on the web. And yeah, check us out.
Okay, just I know our time is starting to come to an end, so just kind of wanted to wrap up. You brought up a good point about the American public and veterans and service members' responsibilities in just actually paying attention to these stories and seeing what's out there. In your experience, any advice for people out there that, you know, obviously you're clicking left and right and don't know how to find their way sometimes?
Oh man. So the biggest question I get from people that like aren't DC people, right? They're just like, how do I keep up with the news? It's probably like me asking how do I figure out how my car works, you know? And that's like for us is like, yeah, you just, I don't know, you read Politico Playbook in the morning and you watch Lester Holt at night and you read the New York Times throughout the day. Like, it's just not that easy for most people. So I always say like, hey, just read your local news or watch it in the morning, pick a major paper or two, like the Washington Post. And then maybe pick a niche outlet of your choice. Maybe you like video games. Maybe you care about the military. Maybe whatever you care about, pick one or two of those outlets and check the front page of the New York Times here and there, and then watch one of the local broadcasts. And then just be really wary of the algorithm. Like, it's fun to Google certain videos. I'm not going to tell anyone to not watch anything for fun, but you watch like 2 videos from maybe like a hyper partisan like YouTube channel or something like that, and it's just going to be your whole algorithm for 6 months.
Yeah, likewise, diversify. And I like Google News. It's got a good aggregation of sites. It's pretty eclectic.
Yeah. And build relationship, like not relationships like you're hanging out and going out to drinks with them, but like with like actual reporters. Like I think outlets, they're big monoliths and they're confusing for again, going back to someone that's working 2 jobs. They don't have time for that. But if you can find like 1 or 2, it could be the Lester Holt or whatever, or you like someone that writes for the New York Times. If you just kind of follow them, and that kind of personalizes a little bit, that builds that trust. That's something that might be helpful. Or you like military.com and you like me or something, you follow that.
I guess some similar thoughts. I mean, I'm increasingly wary of especially nighttime cable television news. Just because it's opinion shows almost across the board, and it really doesn't matter which cable network you pick at this point. That's kind of the direction it's gone. So we're all kind of wading through that, and I mean, as a journalist, sometimes we have to decide whether or not to go on a given show, and think through those consequences as well. So that's a piece. Another piece is I think following individual journalists that you've admired a story or two, and I think it can start as simple as that. And yeah, I mean, I think you can, not in terms of building a personal relationship, but just in terms of just trusting their work. And like there's probably takeaways there in terms of like, okay, they seem to steer away from partisanship. They're not drinking the Kool-Aid. They're just kind of trying to hear everybody out and just present facts.
If you look at like a diet, I don't know if there's anything wrong with partisan news. Maybe you like to, I don't know, listen to Ben Shapiro, watch Bill Maher or something like that. If you view that as like cotton candy or something like that, that's fine. But you still need to, go to the Washington Post or something and eat a steak.
Back in the day, there was an opinion page, an op-ed page. It was presented as such, and I think the trouble now is that what a print newspaper looks like in a social media format or a television news format. It's a lot more complicated. Mm-hmm. It's not well labeled, and news literacy is a thing, and it's a challenge, and probably just needs to be talked about more in general.
Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate those answers. I know we only have a little bit of time left. I'd like to open it up to the floor for any questions or online.
Someone's got to ask one or it's awkward. Oh, there we go.
Hey, somebody's got to do it. Hey, quick question. So I know we were mentioning like advice that you would give for people that were in the process of that were looking into like sharing their stories, sharing with reporters. And you touched a lot about what people could do with active duty and like on the set, but like especially with the social media age, we're seeing a lot more veterans getting involved with like telling their stories and stuff like that. What advice would you give to those people about the things that they would say as well?
You mean like how they would share it or what they should share? Or?
No, more on the how they should share.
I mean, for me, my DMs are always open. No, it's I would say like 90% of the stuff I write is based on conversations with troops on the ground or veterans. That helps me, even if I don't use them as a source necessarily. That tells me what's important or what people are thinking. And it's whatever apparatus is best. There's for me, it might be Twitter DMs or Instagram or Facebook. Or if you go, and this is how most news websites are ran. You go that byline. You saw a reporter write a story and you're like, I want to talk to them about that. You click on that and usually their email address is there. And I'm sure whatever generation of journalists are after me, you can probably reach out to them on like TikTok or something.
Well, so even on the same plane on Zack, though, we're seeing a lot of more veterans getting involved with like actually talking on Twitch as well. Mm-hmm. And that's that more long play, and then podcasts as well. We live in the podcast age, and these things are more long form where people are coming back on a regular basis. How do we see that affecting the spread of the news as well?
I mean, I think with podcasts, I think it's that long form. I mean, I'll give you one example. I interviewed Senator Gillibrand the other day. It was for like 30-45 minutes. And I'm gonna write an article about that. I'm gonna talk to other people. But that could also be served very well with an hour, 2 hour podcast. That is how most people, I subscribe to 15, 16 podcasts. I'm always listening one. I probably listen to 40 hours of podcasts a week. And that is how people are getting the news information from. That's how I figure out really good sources to use sometimes. Like, hey, this person was on this podcast. They had a lot of good things to say. I want to reach out to them. And I think people are going to be reading less traditional news and listening to more long form podcasts and building those personal relationships.
So military veterans in journalism, we provide a range of training opportunities for veterans who want to self-publish or get published as a freelancer, write an op-ed, whatever. So again, I encourage you to check it out if you're interested. But there are also plenty of publications, for example, the War Horse, that are excellent about publishing stories from veterans who want to share from their own perspective.
Yeah, I won't repeat what was said, but I think don't take no for an answer. Like if a reporter's not interested or it's getting dragged out because they're dealing with 9 other stories and breaking news and whatever, and you personally are invested in sharing a specific thing on a specific timeline. Well, I mean, social media allows you to cut the middleman out. That there are the consequences we talked about already in terms of like that's going to live forever. But if you're committed and convinced that you want to get it out there, yeah, you can do it directly. You can do it in threads on Twitter. You can do long form on Facebook, or yeah, you can just look for places to put an op-ed, whether it's Warhorse, whether it's military.com runs them. We run them on occasion. I mean, the challenge is some outlets, there's a lot more competition and a lot more just options. So, just find a spot that feels like you're going to get a yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Unfortunately, just great conversation. Unfortunately, we have to wrap it up. I just want to thank our panelists. Please follow these gentlemen. We have Steve at Stephen Beynon. We have Zack Baddorf at Zack Baddorf on Twitter. And we have Dan Lamothe at Dan Lamothe on Twitter as well. Just great. Once again, thank you for great and insightful opinions. Appreciate you can take time out of your busy schedules to join us. I just want to say thank you to the audience. And this will be the end of our panel, 20 Years of War, the Evolution and Impact of MilVet Media. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.